Many of you have talked to neighbors, you've done the work, and you've talked about what matters to us as Minnesotans. You talked about the idea that we use and say, one Minnesota. It means everyone is valued. Everyone matters.
Despite a pandemic and social unrest in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, voters gave Tim Walz a second term as governor. Let's bring in our political reporter, Hunter Woodall. Good to have you, Hunter. I know you've spent a lot of time in Minnesota, covered Minnesota politics pretty exclusively. I mean, what more can you tell us about Governor Walz? Who is he?
Walz has an interesting background. Like you said, he's a two-term governor right now, first elected in 2018, won a second term in 2022. But before that, he has a background that we don't typically see from running mates these days. He spent, 6 terms in the U.S. House, representing a largely rural district along the Iowa border with Minnesota. That was, a time in his career where he was, more bipartisan, obviously had to, look after the interests of not just the urban centers in that area, but also farms and rural voters in that area. So he has a record that has gone more liberal, more progressive during his time as governor, but he has that background of really being somebody who understands and, lived in rural areas and knows voters in those places.
And talk to us a little bit about his rise in politics. I mean, you touched a little bit on his congressional career and his gubernatorial career, but he's done quite a lot and in a lot of different sectors as well.
Well, this is somebody, he's a former teacher, he's a former football coach that, is happy to go on Twitter and talk about helping win a state championship. He obviously, he's somebody who spent years and years in the Army National Guard. So that background, it's very different than I think we've seen from running mates in recent years, especially on the Democratic side. Now, Minnesota is not a battleground state, it's not a swing state or anything like that, but it is a place where he has had to run against a little bit of Republican extremism, Republicans going farther and farther to the right during his time, both as a congressman and then obviously now as governor. So he's been able to show, okay, he's represented this large area, he knows about farmers, he knows about the Farm Bill and all that, but he's also knowing, okay, his state has been, reliably Democratic in these recent cycles. No Republican has won in a presidential race since Richard Nixon in 1972. There's been a long-standing drought of Republicans winning statewide in Minnesota. So he's been able to show, okay, I can, be that kind of battleground district congressman, but I can also represent a state that is a little bit more blue and, engages in Democratic priorities.
And so from that standpoint, what is his value added to the ticket?
And that's the most fascinating thing here, because we talked about all these VP contenders, and there were governors, and there was obviously talk of Mark Kelly, the Arizona senator, but this is somebody who understands Washington as a House member. This you have to remember that he was elected when George W. Bush was still president, and he's been there during the Obama years. He was there for the initial Trump year, and the big thing too I'd like to point out, he's somebody who Trump overwhelmingly won his district in 2016. Walz still won that seat at the same time. So that shows he can also message to Trump voters. But he also has that executive experience. So he knows Washington, but he knows how to be an executive. So he's somebody you think, okay, he isn't known on the national stage, but he knows how to engage in those executive conversations.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but as you know, progressives were really pushing for him to be tapped as Harris's running mate. A lot in the labor sector were as well. I mean, in terms of his governing style and standpoint, has he done it more from that progressive side or as more of a centrist?
Well, and that's where his record really gets interesting because, he obviously has a bipartisan background from his House days, but in Minnesota, during the first 2 years, during his first term, the Minnesota House, obviously, for a time was under Democratic control. The Minnesota Senate was under Republican control. So you got to work with both sides in that case. But after the 22 midterms, Democrats had unified control of Minnesota government. They were able to enact, major Democratic priorities. I mean, he was able to pass help for free school, breakfast and lunches for children. He was able to ban conversion therapy, to protect abortion rights. Those are major Democratic legislative accomplishments, especially in a state that had more of that divided government in the years before.
All right. Well, Hunter Woodall, I'm sure we will have you back as Governor Walz continues to be introduced to the public, but we thank you so much for bringing your expertise today.
Thank you.